Okay, great. So yet again, hello everyone. We had quite a few very technology-heavy projects presented in the second section, and I'll just finish off with something easy and relaxing and something that did not require quite a lot of code and quite a lot of work. So what I want to talk about today is Tang Dynasty poetry and text reuse in it. And this is pretty much work in progress. So first of all, I will try to be very careful about any kind of claims and interpretations. And second of all, since it's work in progress, it's not really citable. This data needs to be verified. So please be aware of this. But before I jump to any conclusions, I need to define some terms. First of all, what is poetry? What is Tang poetry? It is usually when we talk about classical poetry, we mean a very specific genre, that is a shi poetry. It's a genre that developed some centuries before Tang Dynasty started in China, but this dynasty was supposed to be the golden age of this shi poetry. It is written in classical Chinese, moreover in like a very specific subtype, poetic classical Chinese. And the good thing about it, and the good thing about analyzing it, is that it didn't change much with the time. So despite me taking whole 3 centuries of poetry, the language stayed pretty much the same within it. Then, this poetry was usually highly regulated. It means that the length of the lines, what could be put where, was regulated, and there were a lot of rules around it. There was a wide practice of using direct and indirect citations, allusions, and some of the allusions were consistently used throughout the centuries. There were handbooks that suggested which allusions were good. And also it was kind of a very widely practiced to write poetry in social settings, in love settings, and so on. So what does it mean? It means that there are a lot of chances for people to kind of fall back to cliches when they need to write a letter to someone with a poem in it, for example, and they remember something from a handbook. And it was also not that easy to get out of the regulations of the genre. And the corpus. For the corpus, I take a very famous collection of poems, the Tang Shi, which was compiled in the 18th century. And it was supposed to be the most complete collection. We know now that it was not, but it is one of the best available corpora right now. It has almost 50,000 poems. It is somewhat problematic. Not all of the poems in this corpus actually belong to the Tang dynasty. And some of the poems within the corpus are duplicated, but all of the historical corpora are problematic, and the best we can do is take what we have and do research with it. Now, the method. For this study, my goal was to use a method that is very simple, but effective. So first of all, I defined intertextuality in a very basic way. I was interested in poetic lines that repeat consistently throughout the corpus with only minor changes. And I'm sure there are a lot of very good techniques to do that. But yet again, I used a very simple one, and it is called edit distance or Levenstein distance. So it is a metric that measures difference between 2 sequences of characters. And it counts the amount of operations, such as removing or adding a character to turn one sequence into another. So the more operation one needs, the more different the sequences are. So in order to find out if a line is cited somewhere else in the corpus, one just needs to take this line and compare it to each other line in the corpus and record cases that have a distance smaller than a certain boundary that we set. This is not the most effective method. Cross-referencing all the lines in the corpus to each other takes a lot of time. I'm pretty sure that Donald Sturgeon, that was presenting in the morning, has implemented and knows much better techniques to do this. But as I said, I like the simplicity of this solution. And looking from a very pragmatic point of view, trying to optimize an algorithm might take much more time than running a less effective one and just running it once and forgetting about it. To show how simple it is, I'll just show code very fast. This is it. So we just compare source line to the target line. And if the similarity is over 75% at this point, we record it. To record the lines and to compare everything to everything, you need a bit more. But yet again, it's 22 lines. It's very basic code one learns within first couple of weeks of learning Python, and this code is written in Python. So if anyone's interested, I will be more than happy to share this. It's on my GitHub account. Now, the results. First of all, I just ran this on the whole corpus. And what I found is that among the over 400,000 lines in the corpus, 5% are duplicates of something else. And this was very suspicious because generally, knowing Chinese poetry, one would expect that someone cites someone, but not completely. So they would change something so that the reference is recognizable, but not completely the same. So to check the suspicious thing, I ran the same algorithm, but on the full poems. So if two poems were similar more than 75%, I copied them. And what I discovered is that out of, in the corpus, more than 2,000 poems appeared more than once. Some of them appeared 3 or 4 times. So it means that to clean the corpus out of duplicates, one should have removed over 2,300 poems. I'm aware that there were manual statistics made before that said that there were around 7,000 duplicates, but unfortunately, I'm not too sure how they got these counts. So, but still, it is somewhat similar. Now, removing duplicates was important because otherwise some lines would seem to be important and repeated a lot when they're actually not. So I removed the duplicates and I ran the algorithm again. And several interesting things popped out. First of all, as it turned out, only half of the poets actually wrote anything similar to anyone else, as far as the algorithm could find it out. But when they cited someone, they did it like as much as they could. 17% of the lines in the corpus are almost direct citation of something else. 40% of the poems contain these lines. So half of the corpus is something that cited someone. We knew that Tang poets like to cite each other, but we didn't know that it was to this extent. And the next interesting thing is the type of lines and the amount of types of citations one can find. So there are several supergroups. So for example, there are 38 poems that cite pretty much the same thing. Then there are 32 poems that cite something else. But the most popular thing, as it seems, is one poet writing something and some other poet citing their line, and this never occurring ever again within the corpus. So there are almost 30,000 cases like this. Now, what were the most popular stock phrases? They are all pretty generic. So, for example, thinking about each other but not able to meet. The road is hard. How long can a human life last? No one knows its sound, mind, feelings, name. I do not know where they went, where the fire is, where beautiful women are, my favorite, where immortals are, and so on and so forth. Chang'an is 3,000 li away. It means that someone is complaining that the capital is too far from the person where this person is. There are a couple of motives that kind of persistently pop up in these cliches. First of all, it's about loneliness, about someone departing, or it is something quasi-philosophical about the human life or previous generations. In my previous research, I've shown that Tang Dynasty poets like to complain a lot, but here the statistics just developed the topic for me. So the popular cliche is mostly saying that the world is confusing, life is lonely, and we're all going to die. There might have been two factors at play. First is the social role of poetry. One would often use it. And letters and stock phrases about being apart are very useful in these cases. And the second one might be connected to the form of shi poetry that required the concluding line of a poem to be some broad statement about topic at hand, about life. So all these lines saying that life is fleeting past very fast and so on are kind of expected to happen. Next thing I would like to check in my research, I haven't done it yet, is how much of these cliches actually intersect with poetry handbooks that were written at the time. It seems to me that these are much more simplistic than the ones suggested in the handbooks. And I really wonder how many more really bad cliches, like really generic phrases, we would get if more of the mediocre poetry from the letters would have been saved from the time. There are several problems with this method. First of all, similarity cutoff is arbitrary. In my case, it's 75% similarity. What it means, yet again in this case, is that in some shorter lines, only one change was allowed to be made. So I was really looking for like really clear citations with really clear lines that are very similar to each other. If you change the cutoff, the results would be very differently. Then secondly, because the corpus doesn't have a lot of metadata, what it shows is that lines are similar and nothing more. So we can't say that one poet cited the other poet. We can't say whether it's both of the poets, someone cited someone else from a previous dynasty, or maybe there was some popular motive, popular idea, some inside jokes no one else knew about that all of them cited. And to get that, one would need to create a much better corpus than the one I have. So basically, I can only talk about cliches, authors with similar tastes, and popular ways to describe something and nothing else. And very quickly, a second way of looking at things is doing a network analysis. So imagine I recorded all the poets that cited anyone else. If I do it for the whole corpus, it looks terrible and it's really hard to read, probably because everyone cited everyone consistently, or just because there are over 2,000 poets in this graph. But if one tries to split these poets into communities, some very interesting things pop up. So first of all, there are clear communities that this city, like people who cite each other or people who use similar lines, fall into. It is interesting that I tried doing 5 communities on the corpus, doing more didn't turn out to work very well. And only 2 of the biggest communities were centered around famous poets. So on this graph, each node, each dot is a poet. The lines between them is the availability of similar lines. And the more lines they have in common, the thicker the line, and the more such citations a poet has, the bigger the node. So yet again, only 2 of the 5 groups had some famous poets in the middle. And moreover, like for example, in this graph, there's a Baiji, very famous Tang poet, who was a celebrity poet at the time. But then there are also some other poets like Du Fu or Liu Changqing, who were actually not liked very much, not popular a lot at the time of their lives. They only gained popularity much later. So it's very interesting to see that there was a lot of citation and there was a lot of intertextuality going on, despite these poets not being very popular. Another interesting thing to see is that sometimes you'd expect that if you have one poet, another poet would pop up because they were thought to be very similar. So for example, on the same graph, there is a poet called Yao He, and he was thought to be very similar to Jia Dao, that they have a very similar style, but the second poet is nowhere to be found on this graph. And yet again, it seems that this citations graph, this one and the next one, do not have much in common with our understanding of how poetic groups worked. So being in the same poetic group, writing in the same poetic style and being friends doesn't really mean that 2 poets would use similar lines and similar texts in their works. And I found this really fascinating. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. And yeah, we're running out of time. So thank you, everyone. And I'd be happy to hear any questions.
Thank you, Mariana. Very, very fascinating. We have 2 comments already by Tillman and Rachel. They are in the chat, but please unmute yourself and yeah, please.
Okay, so thanks. So sorry that my daughter is crying in the background, so there might be some noise, but yeah, thanks, Mariana, for this fascinating presentation. I also feel reminded of many things that I came across during the past few years, and I wonder what kind of metadata you have or you're using for all of those Tang Shi. And also if you have tried, and I think I passed this question to Rachel because it goes in a very similar direction, if you have tried to compare those stock phrases to other corpora as well.
Okay, first, the metadata. There is almost none. So basically, I have a corpus of Quantang Shi that was originally taken from CText and then cleaned a bit and put into a JSON format. So it has author, title, epigraph if there was anything, and the poem itself. So there isn't really a lot of helpful data in there, unfortunately. And to make it better, one would need at least to have the dates of lives of the poets or something similar. And
you could maybe try extracting at least some of those from a CBDB. Just an idea.
Yes, yeah. I could, but I really want to finish my dissertation. And this kind of answers the second question as well. It wouldn't be interesting to, for example, to compare it to the poetry of Song Dynasty that came quite soon after the Tang Dynasty. But maybe as a postdoc, I will do that. Right now, I'm doing something slightly different.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes much more sense. So my advice would really be to yeah, finish it and then go after all those trails. And I did this mistake of not doing so don't repeat it.
Yes.
Oh, advice always welcome. Okay, we have a comment by Rachel too. And again, question 2, yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting that Marie seems to have come up with the same thing that I thought, was that the stock phrases that you mentioned seem very close to things like Han Dynasty Yue Fu or like the 古诗十九首 and also maybe poetry from like the Jieran period. So it all feels very kind of gu, like ancient in style, kind of compared to other Tang poetry. So I was wondering if you, I suppose you sort of answered that question as well, but it might be a project for another day. But it seems like expanding it earlier, perhaps rather than later, might be something to get at the issue of these stock phrases.
Yes, it is a good suggestion, and I have thought about it. But the problem is, the earlier we go, the harder it is to get a somewhat working corpus.
Yes.
That would also provide statistics that are somehow plausible.
Yes, it just seems that it comes so much from, I suppose it perhaps wouldn't lend itself so much to a more of a digital humanities approach, perhaps more of a traditional way of looking into where these phrases come from. And I wondered also, I thought it was really interesting that you said that being in the same style or the group of friends didn't necessarily mean that they were citing the same lines. I wondered if perhaps that's because they would seem like they were copying from one another, that perhaps those sorts of lines, everyone would say, oh, well, this person has already done that in their group of friends. Or I wondered if you had any other explanations for that.
Okay, so first of all, regarding the previous thing, I did mention that it is very plausible that in many cases it's just several poets citing something that comes from previous dynasties. It's just that this was a side project of mine, and I will look into this once I'm done with my dissertation.
Of course, yeah.
And the second one, sorry, I forget. I'm getting a bit sleepy because I'm up for 10 hours now. So
it's not important. It's not important. You can go to some of the other questions.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
No, thanks so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We all need constant caffeine intake. So there's a comment by Marie. I also want to mention Maciej put a reference to an article that you might find, and other people too might find interesting, since it went up a bit in the chat. Marie, if you want to also voice your comments.
Yes, hello. It's very interesting. I'm not very surprised by the number of lines that you find quoted. I think it's quite something one could expect, and I think I recognized lines that come from the 古诗十九首 and so on. So if you look into the 文选, you don't need to do it right now, but I think if you check the 文选, the 乐府诗集 and things like that, you'll find a lot of material coming from the end of the Han and the beginning of the Six Dynasties. And I can't remember her name, but there was someone working on this. I might send you an email later on if I find her name again, but someone wrote a dissertation some 10 years ago on the choices that were made in the Tang as regards aesthetics and what they chose to keep during the Tang from the Six Dynasties. And it could be interesting to see if what she thought 10 years ago is confirmed by statistics if you compare these lines with what was where it came from. Yeah, so that's all.
Yes, thank you a lot for the suggestions. I'm really interested in the topic, and I'd be happy if you send the materials to me if you can find them.